is the first time I've spoken in public in a year, other than a handful of city council and county commission meetings. So excited to be here. Also excited because I get to wear my white hat today. I'm a developer attorney, so usually most of you probably know me from my black hat and from the city council. But this issue is, I think, really important for our community. I got involved in sea level rise when my firm was hired by the city of Coral Gables to do a legal analysis for them, because as many of you know, in South Florida, sea level rise is real. It's no longer theoretical in South Florida, and many of those local governments are seeing the impacts on their infrastructure. They're seeing inundation of their roadways. Many of you probably heard of Miami Beach spending a couple of $1 billion to raise their roadways and deal with some of those effects. And so what we were retained by Coral Gables to do was help them understand what are the legal risks of doing nothing, or what are the legal risks of taking several actions. And so that was several years ago, and it got me thinking about, okay, what are the effects here in Tampa going to be, and how can we work together on those. And let me just start by reading. I'd like to read an excerpt from a news article. The title is "High Water Ahead. Scientists say swelling seas will wreak havoc in Florida." And the article started, "Chunks of downtown Tampa and South Florida will be swallowed by gradually rising seas over the next century if federal scientists' predictions are correct." It goes on to introduce a scientist from USF who said people could save a lot of money if they knew what was going to happen beforehand. People don't have to start packing yet. It is not going to be a sudden disaster that will take you by surprise. It will happen slowly. Anybody want to guess when that article was written?
30 years ago.
10 years ago.
1983. Almost 40 years ago. It was written by, many of you probably remember Pat Flinchbaugh. She's now Pat Boyd. She's actually a land use attorney up in the Gainesville area now. In Pat's article, she wrote that the first time the Trib wrote about sea level rise, 1958. So the reason I thought this article was interesting, one of the reasons, was that we have about 40 years ahead of us to make some progress on this issue. And we've done next to nothing in the last 40 years. The slides that I passed out are from the forum that Bill mentioned. All of this, if you Google City of Tampa sea level rise, you'll find the City of Tampa sea level rise page. The city is about at the midpoint of a study through a grant program where the first thing the city did was figure out what's the baseline, right? What are the effects probably going to be of sea level rise? And now the city's in the midst of figuring out, okay, we have the baseline. What do we actually need to do? What are the concrete steps we can take? And so this was a forum to bring together mostly developers, real estate investors, local government employees to figure out what could some of those solutions be. The city's also holding forums with neighborhood groups over time, and that work is just getting kicked off. But this is an excerpt of the slides. If you look at the first slide, again, what the scientists are doing here is there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of risk. And so the reason you see on the graph on the left, you see a low projection, intermediate, and high projection. That's because of the uncertainty involved in making these predictions. But here's the interesting thing, is that if you look at this chart on the right, okay, the NOAA high projection for 2030 is approximately the same as the low projection for 2070. Okay, the high projection for 2060 is the intermediate projection, about the same for 2100. So why is this important? It's kind of an interesting opportunity in decision making, right? Because we can, depending on how we describe this, we can bring people together, right? So if you're in the camp of we need to take immediate action now, and we need to spend sort of the maximum we can afford to fix the problem, right? Then you're looking at these high projections. But if you're on the conservative side and you're saying, well, we do need to take action, but technology is going to advance over time, and so we need to nudge ourselves in the right direction, then we're actually talking about the same thing, we're just looking at a different timeline. If you look at the slides, I also picked, there's a number of study areas. You can just thumb through these. I wanted to give you an idea of how the different projections in the West Shore area affect our decision making. And then towards the back, there is the consolidated slides of, and look, at 2100, at year 2100, the high projection is pretty scary, right? West Shore is gone. MacDill Air Force Base is gone. Davis Island and a lot of the port lanes are gone. But here's the thing, that's what the scientists are telling us is the worst case scenario in 2100. If you look back at the slides in the West Shore area for some of the intermediate predictions at a sooner date, the problem looks pretty manageable. There are going to be property owners that are affected. There's going to be some property owners that lose everything, quite frankly. But the problem can be managed. We can wrap our minds around it. And just the last slide here to frame the issue. This is, we hear a lot about inundation, right? We hear a lot about sort of the Bayshore Boulevard effect. We always see that on the news with every storm event. Bayshore gets flooded, and we can imagine that pretty easily. That happening on a monthly basis. But the unseen effects are where things actually get really expensive. So you can see in this chart, this is actually, I think, a really, really good chart to boil down the issues. We have everything from saltwater intrusion. We think a lot. We love the tree canopy here in Tampa. We're going to see those trees affected. We're going to see stormwater systems that the outfall basically becomes underwater, and then that backs up and causes flooding far inland of the shore. So it's not just a shoreline issue. And then even when we don't have roads that are inundated, the bases of those roads and our utilities are going to be corroded and undermined. So, I'm just a dumb land use lawyer. I'm not the engineer. I'm not the scientist. And so, it's not in my wheelhouse to tell us necessarily what are the scientific fixes, what are the technical fixes. What I have been trying to spread the word on is what are the institutional fixes that we can make. Because I know government, and I can tell you with government, unless we put the right systems in place to make the right decisions, we won't make the right decisions, right? Institutional fixes can nudge us in the right direction. So that's what I've been trying to spread the word on, because, look, we get into these debates about straw bans. I'm here to tell you, we have bigger fish to fry than straw bans, right? We as a community are not going to be the ones that address the causes of sea level rise. But what we can do is prepare now for the effects. So I'd like to give you 3 ideas just to open the conversation. 3 ideas: regional collaboration, requiring sea level rise to be analyzed in decision making, and using incentives in our land development code. Right, the first one is pretty easy, and we talk a lot about this, but it really is important to have regional collaboration. So I sit on the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Commission, and a couple of years ago we started the Resiliency Coalition with 31 member local governments. That body is tasked with going to all of our local governments in the region to figure out what they're doing best to address the effects of sea level rise and resiliency. And then we're compiling that in a report we'll release later this year so that we can figure out what are the low-hanging fruit in this region. Because we know a lot about what's working in South Florida. We know a lot about what's not working, but we have unique geography here, we have unique geology here, and so their solutions may not be our solutions. Second is requiring sea level rise to be analyzed in certain types of decision making. This is really common in federal environmental law. There's a law called NEPA that requires it at the federal level. I'm not talking about reports that cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm talking about the city could adopt a policy that when the city decides to sell land, they go through an RFP process. Maybe if you're going to sell the land and the land is worth over $1 million, you require a restatement by the potential purchasers of the RFP of how they're going to address sea level rise and make the conditions better when they develop the properties. Third idea I'd like to leave you with before we take questions is using incentives in our land development code. There's both, we have to address the negatives and give positive incentives. So let me give you an example. Some of you may have been to the new Publix at Manhattan and Candy. With that Publix, the developer wanted to build up the site, right? It was an antiquated big box store. The developer wanted to get ahead of resiliency issues. The developer wanted to get ahead of flooding issues and build the site up. To do that, we had to take out all the crummy old dying trees that the original developer put in. We were going to replace those trees, but we still had to go to the various review board in the city and spend several tens of thousands of dollars to get there just to do the right thing. So we have a new tree code in Tampa now. Some of those issues have been addressed, but I think it gives you a good example of how our regulations aren't necessarily nudging developers in the right direction. Luckily, this developer wanted to do the right thing, but look, people aren't always going to do the right thing unless you push them in that direction. So that leads me to positive incentives. There's a lot of discussion in the city of Tampa right now about growth. Are we growing too fast? Are we growing too much? But look, as a city, we have to grow up and we need density. Density gets us transit. Density gets us new transportation incentives. We have to, as a community, think about using density as the nudge to make projects more resilient. Some cities have a matrix of you have 10 things you can do, you pick 2, and that's how you get your additional density. So that's how we start nudging projects in the right direction. So in closing, here's the opportunity. Is that, as I said, if you look at the data, we have about 40 years before we really are going to see, I think, the severe effects that we have to stand up and take notice of. So we have 40 years, okay? If you're looking at commercial buildings, what's the life? You plan on a 40-year life of a commercial building, right? So most of our city is going to be redeveloped within our time frame. So that's the opportunity and the challenge, is that the deadline isn't right upon us, but we have 40 years and we have time to nudge development in the right direction.